Many believe Alfred the Great forged England as we know it, but what if I told you that despite his genius, he left his son a nation on the brink of collapse, fragmented and under Viking rule? Prepare to uncover the history of a king often overshadowed, but whose conquests are the true foundation of England. Today we'll reveal how Edward the Elder, a king with an immense burden and even greater ambition, took his father's dream and turned it into a bloody and glorious reality. He didn't just defend what remained, he reconquered, unified, and, in less than 25 years, rewrote the destiny of an entire island. If this statement surprised you and you want to dive deep into the secrets of Anglo-Saxon royalty, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss any episodes of our journey through history. And if you have an epic story you'd like to see uncovered here, tell us in the comments. Your suggestion helps spread knowledge and bring these incredible narratives to more people. Let us know where you're watching from so we can connect our global community of history lovers. The late 9th century in Great Britain was a landscape of fragmentation and tension, a complex tapestry woven with the threads of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and Viking enclaves. After the death of the legendary Alfred the Great in 899, the kingdom of Wessex, though the most powerful, was not the only center of power, nor did it control the entire island. Alfred, with his vision and tenacity, had managed to curb the Danish advance, especially after the decisive Battle of Edington in 878. However, his triumph did not mean the complete expulsion of the Norsemen. Instead, the Danelaw was established, a vast area in eastern and northern England where Danish law and customs prevailed. This geographical division was also a cultural and political one, with Anglo-Saxon populations under Viking rule living under a foreign yoke, and the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, the latter largely controlled by Vikings, maintaining a tense and, at times, hostile coexistence. Alfred's legacy was, therefore, a solid but unusual foundation for nation-building. He had reformed the army, invested in education and culture, and, crucially, established the idea of a unified Anglo-Saxon resistance against the Viking threat. However, his death left a leadership vacuum in a scenario where the Viking threat, though contained, had not disappeared. Incursions continued to be a constant shadow, and the Viking kings established in the Danelaw saw the wealth of the south as a perennial target. Coexistence was fragile, and peace a relative concept. Mercia, traditionally a powerful kingdom, was now under the influence of Wessex, led by Aethelred and his wife Æthelflæd, Alfred's daughter. Northumbria, in turn, was a mosaic of small Viking kingdoms and warlords, a cauldron of conflicts and ambitions. The economy of the time, predominantly agrarian, suffered from the constant devastations of Viking raids. Villages were plundered, cultivated lands abandoned, and trade, though resilient, was precarious. Roman infrastructure had collapsed centuries earlier, and Anglo-Saxon towns were few and far between, most of them small and poorly protected. Royal authority in Wessex, though centralized, needed to project itself over a complex network of shires and ealdormen, local nobles, who held considerable power. Loyalty, often, was more personal than institutional. In this uncertain scenario, with the memory of Viking devastation still fresh and the promise of a unified England still distant, the stage was set for a new leader, someone who would not only continue Alfred's work, but dare to go further, confronting division and external threats, with an even more ambitious vision for the island's future. England's destiny hung on the next King of Wessex's ability to navigate these turbulent waters and forge a path to unity. At the dawn of the 10th century, after the revered figure of Alfred the Great departed this world, the burden of an unstable kingdom and a divided nation fell upon the shoulders of his son Edward. He ascended the throne of Wessex in 899, not as an unquestionable sovereign, but as an heir in a period of great uncertainty. Unlike his father, whose reign was marked by the desperate defense of Wessex's existence, Edward inherited a more robust kingdom, but with its own challenges. It was no longer just about survival, but about prospering and, more ambitiously, expanding. Edward, still young, faced the difficult task of consolidating his authority in a kingdom that had grown accustomed to Alfred's imposing shadow. His education, though Spartan, had been carefully supervised by Alfred, who saw in Edward the successor to his vision. He was trained in the arts of war and governance, imbued with the principles of military leadership and administration that his father had perfected. However, theory is one thing, practice is another. Upon taking the throne, Edward did not have the same renown or the legendary aura that Alfred had built. His challenges were multiple, ensuring the loyalty of the ealdormen of Wessex, many of whom saw themselves as capable leaders, dealing with the ever-present Viking threat, which, though contained, still represented a latent danger, and, perhaps most subtly, projecting his own leadership image that could inspire the same trust and devotion as his father. Edward's ascension was not without controversy. The royal lineage was, in that period, often disputed, and succession was not always linear. The legitimacy of his reign would be tested in the early years, not only by Viking swords but by the ambitions of his own relatives. His youth, though promising, also raised doubts about his ability to lead. Anglo-Saxon society, with its hierarchical structure and respect for experience, watched every move of the new king closely. Edward, therefore, could not afford to make mistakes. Every decision, every campaign would be evaluated in comparison to his father's legacy. He needed not only to govern, but to prove his worth, forging his own reputation as a military and political leader equal to the task. His crown, more than a symbol of power, was a heavy burden of expectations and dangers, and the young king was about to discover the true dimension of his responsibility. Hardly had the dust settled over Alfred the Great's tomb, when a threat even more insidious than Viking incursions arose to challenge the newly enthroned King Edward, the rebellion of Æthelflæd. Æthelflæd was Edward's cousin, son of Aethelred, Alfred's older brother, who had died before he could inherit the throne. By Anglo-Saxon tradition, which sometimes valued seniority in the royal lineage, Æthelflæd had a legitimate claim to the throne of Wessex. His ambition was not just a matter of personal power, it was a direct questioning of Edward's authority, and by extension, of the kingdom's stability. The dispute began almost immediately after Alfred's death. Æthelflæd, sensing his opportunity, occupied the royal centers of Wimborne and Christchurch, declaring himself king. This initial audacity, though quickly contained by forces loyal to Edward, revealed the fragility of the power transition. The rebellious cousin did not surrender. Instead, he fled to the Danelaw, seeking refuge among the Vikings of East Anglia and Northumbria. This alliance with the historical enemies of the Anglo-Saxons was a strategic and symbolic blow. It meant that the threat was not only internal, but a dangerous combination of Anglo-Saxon discontent and Viking power. Æthelflæd became a catalyst for dissent, attracting other discontented Anglo-Saxons to him, and, more dangerously, convincing the Vikings to support his cause with the promise of plunder and territory. In 902, he led a Viking fleet from East Anglia on a devastating raid through Wessex and Mercia, plundering and burning. Edward was forced to respond, and his troops retaliated by invading East Anglia. The climax of this contention occurred at the Battle of the Fens, or more precisely, a large confrontation in 902 or 903, the specific details of which are scarce, but which resulted in Æthelflæd's death. Æthelflæd's death was a crucial moment. It rid Edward of a dangerous internal rival, and consolidated his position on the throne of Wessex. The rebellion, though costly in lives and resources, demonstrated Edward's ability to handle internal and external crises simultaneously. It forced him to act quickly and decisively, proving his leadership at a critical moment. Furthermore, Æthelflæd's alliance with the Vikings underscored the relentless nature of the Norse threat and the need for an aggressive policy to contain them. With the rebellion suppressed, Edward could finally turn his attention to the greater task that awaited him, the unification of England and the reconquest of territories lost to the Danelaw. The trial by fire had been overcome, and the young king was ready to forge his own legacy. With the threat of Æthelflæd neutralized, Edward the Elder could finally turn his attention to the consolidation of Wessex, a fundamental step before any expansionist endeavor. He understood that a strong and cohesive kingdom was the basis for any greater ambition. The first actions of his reign, therefore, focused on reinforcing the internal structure of his domain, improving administration, and ensuring the loyalty of his subjects. The experience with his cousin's rebellion had taught him the importance of eliminating internal fissures that could be exploited by enemies. Edward initiated a program of administrative and ecclesiastical reorganization. Although the exact details of his reforms are sometimes obscure in historical sources, it is evident that he worked to centralize royal power, perfecting the shire system and the appointment of loyal ealdormen. These ealdormen, who acted as regional governors, were crucial for collecting taxes, administering justice, and, most importantly, for mobilizing troops in times of war. By ensuring that these key positions were filled by men he trusted, Edward minimized the risk of new rebellions and strengthened his command capacity over the entire kingdom. The church also played a vital role in Edward's consolidation strategy. He maintained the close relationship with the clergy that his father had established, using the church as a pillar of stability and a tool for disseminating royal authority. The appointment of loyal bishops and the promotion of monasteries were not just acts of piety, but also calculated political moves to ensure intellectual and moral support for his reign. The church, with its network of schools and scribes, was also essential for maintaining records and transmitting royal decrees. Furthermore, Edward continued and expanded his father's policy of minting coins. The uniformity of coinage was not just an economic convenience, it was a tangible symbol of royal authority and the kingdom's unity. Coins with his effigy circulating throughout Wessex and beyond reinforced the idea of a centralized government and prosperous trade under his aegis. This economic and administrative stability, combined with internal pacification, allowed Edward to accumulate the resources and manpower necessary for the military campaigns that would follow. He was building not just an army, but a state machine capable of sustaining a long-term war and managing the territories that would be reconquered. The consolidation of Wessex was, in essence, the preparation for the great undertaking of forging a united England, a process that would require not only military strength, but also astute administration and unshakable royal power. For any Anglo-Saxon king of the era, the survival of the kingdom was intrinsically dependent on its military capability, and Edward the Elder understood this deeply. After consolidating his position in Wessex, he diligently dedicated himself to military reorganization, transforming the feared Anglo-Saxon militia into a more disciplined and effective force, capable of confronting the mobility and ferocity of Viking hosts. His father Alfred's experience, who had faced near annihilation, served as a harsh lesson about the need for a robust and proactive defense. The Fyrd, though numerous, was traditionally composed of free men who served for a limited period, usually during harvest time, which made it unsuitable for prolonged campaigns or rapid responses to unexpected incursions. Edward, following in Alfred's footsteps, improved the system of rotating military service, ensuring that a portion of the Fyrd was always ready for combat, while the other tended to the lands. This allowed the king to have a continuous force available, without completely disrupting the agrarian economy. Additionally, Edward invested in light cavalry, a tactic that the Vikings used with great success for quick raids and plunder. Although the Anglo-Saxons were traditionally an infantry force, the ability to pursue and intercept Viking raids became crucial. The creation of a body of horsemen, or warriors with access to horses for mobility, though not for large-scale mounted combat like in later medieval cavalry, increased the agility of his forces. The formation of Thagens, a class of military nobles directly loyal to the king, was also improved. These thanes were professional warriors, well-equipped and trained, who formed the core of the royal army. They were rewarded with lands and prestigious positions, ensuring their loyalty and encouraging military excellence. Their presence provided experienced leadership and a backbone for the Fyrd. Crucially, Edward's military reorganization was not just about the number of men or the type of weaponry. It was about discipline and coordination. He improved the army's logistics, ensuring that troops had supplies and could move quickly to where they were needed. The experience of his reign demonstrates an army that operated with more cohesion and effectiveness than previous Anglo-Saxon forces. This improved military force, combined with his fortification strategy, would be the key to the reconquest of the Danelaw. Edward was building not just an army to defend itself, but a war machine to expand Wessex's dominion, paving the way for the unification of England. The shadow of the Viking threat would now be met not with passive resistance, but with a calculated and relentless offensive. Edward the Elder's military strategy wasn't limited to troop mobilization and warrior training. A fundamental pillar of his campaign against the Vikings and his policy of territorial consolidation was the construction and repair of Burhs, the Anglo-Saxon fortified towns. This tactic, initiated and perfected by his father, Alfred the Great, became even more systematic under Edward's reign, transforming the landscape of England and the dynamics of warfare. The Burhs were not just defensive strongholds. They were centers of control, trade, and administration, essential for pacifying newly conquered territories and protecting the Anglo-Saxon population. The primary function of a burh was to offer safe refuge in case of a Viking attack. Generally built in strategic locations, such as hills or river bends, they were protected by earth and wooden walls, and, in some cases, by ditches. Within their defenses, the local population and their belongings could find shelter, and the fyrd could gather to repel invaders. The network of Wessex burhs formed a defensive shield that covered the kingdom, making Viking incursions more difficult and less profitable, as there were fewer places to plunder with impunity. However, the role of the burhs was much broader. They were pillars of royal authority. Each burh had a permanent garrison and a reeve, royal magistrate, who administered justice and collected taxes on behalf of the king. By establishing these centers of power, Edward extended his influence and control over regions further from his capital. This network allowed for more efficient administration and quicker mobilization of resources for the war effort. Beyond defense and administration, the burhs were economic engines. Protected from incursions, they became centers of trade, attracting merchants and artisans. Coinage was frequently carried out within their walls, and the markets that arose around them promoted the economic recovery of war-devastated regions. This prosperity, in turn, reinforced the population's loyalty to the king, who guaranteed security and opportunity. As Edward advanced over the Danelaw, he not only reconquered cities, but also built new burhs in enemy territories, solidifying his domain. Each new burh erected was a concrete step in the unification of England, a foothold for the next offensive. This fortification strategy, combined with military reorganization, allowed Edward to transform his father's defensive war into an offensive campaign, pushing the Vikings out of Anglo-Saxon lands and establishing a new order on the island. With Wessex consolidated and its military force enhanced, Edward the Elder was ready to turn the tide against the Vikings. His vision was not limited to defense. He aspired to expand eastward, retaking the Danelaw lands that had been lost in previous decades. These early campaigns marked a significant strategic shift, from a defensive policy under Alfred to a systematic and determined attack to reverse Viking conquests. The objective was clear: dismantle Danish power in England and pave the way for unification. Edward's initial campaigns focused on the regions closest to Wessex, particularly the Midlands and East Anglia, where Viking control was most consolidated and where geographical proximity made logistical operations more feasible. His strategy involved a combination of military force, burh construction, and, in some cases, diplomacy. Edward didn't just win battles, he secured territory, methodically integrating it into his domain. One of the first significant targets was the Viking kingdom of Essex. Although specific details of all campaigns are scarce in the chronicles of the time, it is known that Edward launched calculated offensives, often coordinating his movements with his sister, Aethelflæd, the Lady of the Mercians. This strategic collaboration between siblings was an important differentiator, allowing coordinated attacks on multiple fronts and dividing Viking forces. The expansion to the east was not a continuous and unobstructed advance. The Vikings, with their ferocity and mobility, still represented a formidable adversary. There were victories, but also setbacks and stalemates. However, Edward's determination was unwavering. He used the newly built or repaired burhs as bases of operations, consolidating each territorial gain before moving on to the next. Each burh retaken or founded represented not only a military victory, but an outpost of Anglo-Saxon administration and power. These first campaigns laid the groundwork for the broader reconquest of the Danelaw. Edward was systematically dismantling Viking rule, town by town, territory by territory. He was showing that the era of Viking hegemony in England had come to an end, and that a new force was emerging. The ambition of a unified kingdom, once a dream of his fathers, began to take shape under Edward's firm and strategic command. Every step eastward was a step toward a redesigned England, free from foreign rule and united under the crown of Wessex. In the geopolitical chess game of 10th century England, strategic marital alliances were as powerful as swords. Edward the Elder profoundly understood this dynamic. Beyond his military prowess, he used marriages, both his own and those of his numerous daughters, as crucial diplomatic tools to consolidate his power, extend his influence, and forge political ties that strengthened Wessex's position in Great Britain and beyond. These unions were not just personal arrangements. They were acts of state that wove a complex web of loyalties and interconnections. Edward married 3 times. His first union with Ecgwin produced his eldest son and eventual successor, Æthelflæd. Although the status of this union is debated by historians, some consider it a marriage, others a concubinage, Æthelflæd's importance is undeniable. His second wife, Aethelflaed, a noblewoman from Wessex, bore him several sons and daughters, strengthening his connection to the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. Finally, his marriage to Eadgifu of Kent, from a prominent southeastern family, produced 2 future kings, Edmund and Adred, and further solidified his power. Each marriage served to ensure a robust succession and to forge ties with important families within his own kingdom. However, the most significant impact of his marital alliances came through his daughters. Edward had a remarkable number of daughters, and he skillfully used them as pawns in his diplomatic game. Many of them were married to kings and princes from continental Europe, raising Wessex's prestige and creating a network of international alliances. For example, Eadgith married Otto I, the Great, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, one of Europe's most powerful rulers. This union conferred unparalleled status on Edward and ensured Wessex's recognition on the European stage. Eadhild was married to Hugh the Great, Duke of the Franks and father of Hugh Capet, founder of the Capetian dynasty of France. Ælfgifu married Louis, Prince of Aquitaine. These marriages were not mere formalities. They provided Edward with a voice in European politics, discouraged potential alliances against him, and in some cases, offered refuge for his heirs should Wessex face a catastrophe. Edward's reputation as a powerful king and father of many marriageable princesses increased the prestige of the Wessex court, attracting scholars, artists, and diplomats. Through these marital alliances, Edward wove an intricate web of relationships that extended Wessex's influence far beyond the borders of Great Britain, solidifying his position as one of Europe's most important royal houses of the time. He was, in fact, weaving the lineage of a future European royal dynasty, while consolidating power at home. Among the stories intertwined with the rise of Edward the Elder and his journey to unite England, there existed the legend of the lost sword. It is crucial to note that this is a topic that falls within the realm of folklore and tradition, without any historical corroboration in chronicles or documents of the time. However, in an era where faith and mysticism walked hand in hand with the brutal reality of war, such narratives held considerable weight in the popular imagination, and perhaps even in the morale of the troops. The legend narrated the existence of an ancient blade, forged by legendary smiths in immemorial times, perhaps even with the blessing of saints or converted pagan deities. It was said that this sword, lost centuries before in some forgotten battle or hidden to protect its power, possessed a mystical quality. It would guide its rightful wielder in the most difficult conquests, revealing enemy weaknesses or inspiring unwavering courage in its allies. It was not just a weapon, but a symbol of destiny, a harbinger of victory for whoever found it and was worthy of wielding it. For Edward, whose legitimacy, though solid, was constantly tested by internal and external rivals, the mere existence of such a legend, even if he had not found it, could have served a purpose. In times of war, hope and a sense of divine or predestined purpose could galvanize troops in the population. The idea that the king, in his quest for unification, was somehow connected to a greater power, or that a tool for his success already existed in the world, could have reinforced belief in his mission. Rumors about this sword could arise organically among the Thens or be subtly encouraged by the court itself. One can imagine that on cold camp nights before a great battle, stories of bravery and destiny were told, and the legend of the lost sword could be one of them, igniting faith in imminent victory. It could have been a metaphor for Edward's unbreakable determination and the conviction of his cause. Although there are no records of Edward actively seeking this sword or having used it in battle, the inclusion of this legend in the Anglo-Saxon collective imagination of the time underlines the importance of the mythical element and popular belief in legitimizing power and inspiring the struggle. It adds a layer of mystery and grandeur to Edward's figure, transforming a military and political leader into an almost mythical character, destined to fulfill a great prophecy, even if that prophecy was fueled more by hope than by facts. Edward the Elder's campaign to reclaim the Danelaw was not a simple triumphal march. It was a complex series of confrontations in the southern Danelaw, involving not only bloody battles, but also intricate negotiations and the relentless construction of burhs to consolidate each gain. The southern Danelaw, which included regions like Essex, Middlesex, where London was located, Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire, was strategic due to its proximity to Wessex and its economic and demographic importance. The Viking kingdoms in these areas were governed by Danish jarls and kings who, though sometimes disunited, were formidable adversaries. Edward's strategies varied according to the adversary and geography. He used the numerical and organizational superiority of his fyrd and his thegns for prolonged sieges and direct open-field confrontations. However, he also employed the tactic of outflanking and isolating Viking settlements, cutting off their supply and communication lines, forcing them to surrender. The construction of burhs parallel to existing Viking settlements was a masterstroke. It not only provided a base for Anglo-Saxon operations, but also served as a center of attraction for the local population, who saw in Edward's protection an alternative to the instability of Viking rule. Negotiations also played a crucial role. Edward did not seek mere annihilation. He sought submission and integration. In many cases, after a significant military defeat, Viking leaders were forced to swear loyalty to Edward, accepting his dominion in exchange for retaining part of their lands or influence. These submissions, often sealed with the baptism of Viking leaders, a symbolic gesture of acceptance of the Christian faith, and by extension Anglo-Saxon order, were important victories without additional bloodshed. However, these agreements were often fragile and required constant vigilance. A notable example of these confrontations occurred in Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire. Edward led campaigns that encircled and took the Viking strongholds of Hertford and Bedford. In Bedford, for instance, he built a new burh in 915 on the opposite side of the river, effectively encircling the Viking stronghold and forcing its surrender. This double burh tactic, where a new Anglo-Saxon fortification was erected to rival and eventually subdue an existing Viking stronghold, was successfully repeated on several occasions. With each victory, each surrender, the southern Danelaw shrank, and Wessex's border extended northward and eastward. The recovered territories were immediately integrated into Anglo-Saxon administration, with the appointment of reeves and the imposition of Edward's laws. These systematic campaigns not only reclaimed lands, but also reversed the demographics and culture of these regions, reintroducing Anglo-Saxon law and Wessex's hegemony. The confrontations in the southern Danelaw were the backbone of the Reconquest, demonstrating Edward's tenacity, cunning, and military effectiveness in building his unified England. If this story inspired you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more epic narratives, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. What other stories would you like to see here? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from so we can bring knowledge to every corner of the world. Your participation helps spread history and inspire new generations. Among the provinces of the southern Danelaw, the fall of Essex represented a significant milestone in Edward the Elder's Reconquest campaigns. This region, which included the important city of Colchester, was a fundamental strategic point. Its location, close to London and trade routes and the presence of a strong Viking garrison, made it a high-priority target. The recapture of Essex was not an isolated event, but the culmination of a series of military maneuvers and a demonstration of the effectiveness of Edward's strategy. Essex, like other parts of the Danelaw, was under the direct control of Danish jarls who governed with considerable autonomy. They represented a constant threat to the borders of Wessex and Mercia. The campaign to reclaim Essex was carefully planned, utilizing the experience gained in previous confrontations and the network of burhs that Edward had systematically built. The main city of Essex, Colchester, was an ancient Roman city, though in ruins, that had been fortified by the Vikings. Conquering it meant not only the recapture of a populated center, but the breaking of an important stronghold for Danish forces in East Anglia. Anglo-Saxon chronicles, though concise, record that in 917, Edward launched a decisive offensive against Colchester. Wessex forces, likely supported by contingents from Mercia under Aethelflaed's command, besieged the city. The siege was intense, and Viking resistance must have been fierce given the importance of the location. The fall of Colchester marked a turning point. The city was taken by storm, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a testament to Edward's ability to conduct successful assaults on enemy fortifications. With the capture of Colchester, Viking authority in Essex was irremediably broken. The surrender of the remaining Viking leaders in the region followed, many of them paying homage to Edward and recognizing his suzerainty. The reconquest of Essex had multiple ramifications. Firstly, it paved the way for the subsequent campaign in East Anglia, isolating the Viking forces in that region. Secondly, it restored Anglo-Saxon control over a rich and productive area, which could now be integrated into the Wessex administration, contributing taxes and men to the fjord. Thirdly, the fall of such an important Viking center sent a clear message to the other Danish kingdoms in the Danelaw. The reconquest was relentless and systematic. The victory in Essex demonstrated Edward's strategic and tactical superiority, further solidifying his reputation as a formidable military leader and a kingdom builder. While Edward the Elder forged his path to unification in the south and east of England, a figure of equal stature and military ferocity operated in the north. His sister, Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, daughter of Alfred the Great and wife of Æthelred, Ealdorman of Mercia. Æthelflaed emerged as one of the most remarkable female leaders in Anglo-Saxon history. Her role was not merely supportive but that of a co-ruler and independent military commander, whose actions were crucial to the overall strategy of reconquest. After the death of her husband, Æthelred, in 911, Æthelflæd assumed full control of Mercia, governing with unprecedented authority for a woman of the time. She was not a nominal queen. She was a war leader and administrator. Her leadership in Mercia was fundamental for the security of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom and for the continuous pressure on Viking settlements in the east and north. Her relationship with Edward was one of strategic partnership, with both siblings coordinating their campaigns to maximize the impact on the Danish invaders. Æthelflæd demonstrated remarkable military acumen and tireless dedication to the burh-building strategy initiated by her father and brother. She oversaw the fortification of a series of Mercian towns, including Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick, and Chester. Each of these burhs served as a point of defense and administrative center, and a base for future offensives. The construction of Chester in particular was a bold maneuver, consolidating Anglo-Saxon control over a region bordering Viking and Welsh territory. Her military campaigns were equally impressive. Æthelflæd led Mercian forces in direct attacks against Viking settlements, achieving significant victories. In 917, for example, she took Derby, one of the 5 burhs of the Danelaw, the main Viking fortified towns in the Midlands. This conquest was a devastating blow to Danish power in the region. The following year, she secured the submission of Leicester without bloodshed, a testament to her reputation and the effectiveness of her tactics. Æthelflæd's impact was immense. She not only protected Mercia's borders and reconquered lands, but also inspired loyalty and fear among her subjects and adversaries, respectively. Her leadership, combined with Edward's, created a powerful pincer movement that crushed Viking resistance from two directions. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes her with reverence, and her role in preparing the ground for the unification of England is unquestionable. Aethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, was, undoubtedly, one of the most important architects of united England. Among the greatest challenges and triumphs of Edward the Elder and his sister Æthelflæd stands the reconstruction of London, a monumental effort to restore and repopulate the city after years of Viking occupation and devastation. The ancient Roman Londinium, which had been a vibrant center of power and commerce, was in a precarious state at the end of the 9th century. Although Alfred the Great had retaken London in 886 and begun its repair, the city was still far from its former glory, and required continuous work under his successors to become a pole of civilization again. London's importance was multifaceted. Its strategic location on the River Thames, which linked the heart of England to the North Sea, made it a vital center for trade and defense. Furthermore, the city held profound symbolic significance. It was one of the few tangible inheritances of Roman power in Great Britain, and its recovery and flourishing would be a visible testament to the restoration of Anglo-Saxon order. Under Edward, the reconstruction work intensified. Although the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle attributes the capture of London and its repopulation to Alfred, the maintenance and development of the city under Edward and Æthelflæd were crucial. It is likely that Æthelflæd, as Lady of the Mercians, had a significant role in overseeing the region, as London was located on the border between Wessex and Mercia, and Alfred had entrusted it to the custody of his son-in-law, Æthelred of Mercia. The reconstruction effort went beyond simply erecting walls. It involved restoring infrastructure, clearing rubble, and fundamentally encouraging repopulation. People were attracted to London with promises of protection and economic opportunities. The establishment of markets and the guarantee of security for merchants were essential to revitalizing the city's economy. The presence of a permanent garrison ensured order and deterred new Viking incursions. The reconstruction of London was a testament to Edward and Æthelflæd's long-term vision. They were not merely reconquering lands, they were restoring civilization and prosperity. The city gradually regained its role as a vital commercial center and a crucial defensive point against riverine incursions. Its revitalization was a tangible sign that the tide of war was turning in favor of the Anglo-Saxons. London, once a scar of Viking devastation, was being transformed into a beacon of hope and a symbol of Wessex's growing power, a fundamental step in building a united and prosperous England. In any growing royal court amidst prolonged warfare, paranoia and whispers were constant companions. In the kingdom of Edward the Elder, although his court was a center of authority and loyalty, enigmas and rumors of Viking spies infiltrating Wessex proliferated. It is essential to emphasize that these are claims without concrete historical corroboration in documents of the period. However, the absence of proof does not mean the absence of suspicion in a time of intense espionage and counter-espionage, where information was a weapon as valuable as the sword. 10th century England was a mosaic of fluid loyalties and permeable borders. With the adjacent Danelaw and the enduring commercial and social relations between Anglo-Saxon and Norse communities, the possibility of infiltration was real. Merchants, travelers, or even Anglo-Saxon dissidents could, intentionally or unintentionally, pass information to Viking jarls. Rumors of spies could arise from any security incident, a discovered attack plan, or an unexpected defeat that needed an explanation. Edward's court, being the epicenter of Wessex's power and the mastermind behind the Reconquest, would naturally be a primary target for Viking intelligence. Information about Edward's battle plans, the movement of his troops, the state of his Burhs, or even the king's health, would be invaluable to his enemies. The paranoia about the presence of Viking eyes and ears could have led to increased vigilance within the court, loyalty tests, and severe punishments for those deemed traitors. These rumors, true or false, would have a psychological impact on the court. They would create an environment of caution and distrust, forcing Edward and his advisors to be even more selective about whom they trusted and how information was disseminated. It could even justify the adoption of stricter security measures, and the use of codes or secret messengers for the most sensitive communications. In the context of an epic script, the idea of infiltrated spies adds a layer of suspense and drama to the narrative. It suggests that Edward's war was not just fought on battlefields, but also behind the scenes, in a game of shadows where loyalty was constantly tested. While we cannot point to a specific Viking spy captured in Edward's court, the presence of these rumors highlights the complexity and precariousness of security in the medieval era, and the constant challenge of maintaining a unified kingdom in the face of multifaceted threats, both visible and invisible. Amidst the victories and progress of Edward the Elder, one of the most decisive and often underestimated battles of his reign was the Battle of Tettenhall, which occurred in 910. Although not as widely known as his father's Battle of Edington, or even the future Battle of Brunanburh, Tettenhall was a confrontation of epic proportions that inflicted a devastating defeat on the Northumbrian Vikings, marking a crucial turning point in the Reconquest War. In that year, the Northumbrian Vikings, tired of Edward and Aethelflaed's incursions into the Midlands, or perhaps sensing an opportunity, launched a large retaliatory raid. They invaded Mercia, penetrating deep into Anglo-Saxon territory, plundering and devastating villages. The audacity and scale of the attack represented a direct challenge to Edward's authority and the security of his allied kingdoms. Edward, who was in Kent, quickly mobilized his forces. He did not attack immediately, but allowed the Vikings to plunder, and as they returned home, laden with their spoils, he intercepted them. Chronicles suggest that Edward's forces included not only his own thanes from Wessex, but also a considerable part of the Fyrd, and crucially the forces of Mercia, probably commanded by loyal Ealdorman. Although Aethelflaed was not directly present in the battle, she was busy on other fortification fronts. The battle took place near Tettenhall in Staffordshire. It was a brutal and bloody confrontation, a demonstration of the ferocity of both sides. The Anglo-Saxons, motivated by the defense of their lands and revenge for the looting, fought with unwavering determination. The timing of the confrontation was strategic. The Vikings, loaded with booty and possibly caught off guard on their way home, were surprised by the full force of the Anglo-Saxon army. The result was a resounding victory for Edward. Chronicles report that 3 Viking kings, possibly from York and Danelaw, and numerous jarls fell in combat. The annihilation of the Northumbrian Viking forces at Tettenhall was a paralyzing blow. It effectively broke the backbone of organized Viking power in the north for a significant period, eliminating much of their leadership and capacity to launch large incursions. Although often overshadowed by other events, Tettenhall was, in fact, the forgotten battle that sealed the fate of northern England. It paved the way for future campaigns by Edward and Æthelflæd in the region, and confirmed Anglo-Saxon military superiority. It was a moment of decisive triumph that consolidated Edward's vision of a unified England, demonstrating that they could not only defend their lands, but also destroy their invaders with overwhelming force. While Edward the Elder was a formidable military leader, his governance was not based solely on brute force. He was also an astute strategist who understood the importance of diplomacy and tribute. At various points in his reign, Edward opted for agreements and payments to avoid direct conflicts, especially when a battle would be unnecessarily costly, or when a tactical ceasefire could serve a larger purpose in his Unification campaign. This pragmatism was an extension of the wisdom that Alfred the Great had bequeathed to his son. The practice of paying Danegeld, Danish money, or tributes to the Vikings was not a display of weakness, but often a maneuver to gain time, avoid the devastation of valuable lands, or divert the attention of a group of invaders while other war fronts were prioritized. For a medieval king, the preservation of his resources, both human and economic, was fundamental. A Pyrrhic victory, which exhausted the treasury and the ranks of his army, could be as damaging as a defeat. Edward, for example, occasionally made agreements with Viking leaders to ensure temporary peace in certain regions, allowing him to concentrate his forces elsewhere. These peaces were often accompanied by exchanges of hostages and solemn oaths, but above all, by the delivery of silver. In 906, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions a peace agreement at Tittingford, where Edward made peace with the northern Vikings. a move that may have been a strategic pause before his more ambitious offensive. These agreements were not made out of fear, but out of calculation. If a temporary payment could divert a Viking fleet from a vital objective, or if it could buy the loyalty, however volatile, of a Viking jarl, Edward was willing to consider the option. He used gold and silver to avoid bloodshed, and to protect the towns and fields of his kingdom that were prospering under his administration. It was a form of economic warfare, where resources could be used to avoid the even greater cost of total war. Furthermore, Edward's diplomacy extended to other British rulers. He not only imposed his authority by force, but also built relationships through treaties, and, as seen, through marriages. He knew that the unification of England would require more than conquests. It would require the integration of different peoples and the consent, however reluctant, of their leaders. By balancing military force with diplomatic cunning, Edward proved to be a complete ruler, capable of using all the tools at his disposal to shape the destiny of his kingdom, and ultimately, of a nation. Amidst the factual history of Edward the Elder's conquests and the pragmatic reality of his search for resources, an intrigue emerged that captured the popular imagination: the legend of the hidden treasure. This is a narrative rooted in folklore and speculation, without any historical corroboration in records of the time, but one that resonates with the atmosphere of a period of stolen riches and buried secrets. It was said that, somewhere, a vast Viking treasure, accumulated over decades of raids and pillaging throughout Great Britain and beyond, lay hidden, and that Edward, aware of this legend, was seeking it to finance his incessant wars. The Vikings, known for their thirst for wealth, accumulated vast quantities of gold, silver, and jewels from their raids. Many of these treasures were buried to be retrieved later, in secret locations known only to their chieftains or a select group. The idea of a treasure so vast that it could turn the tide of a war was seductive. The legend suggested that this specific treasure, perhaps from a legendary Viking king or a particularly successful fleet, had never been fully recovered after the death of its guardians or after a hasty retreat. For Edward, the need to finance his campaigns was a constant reality. The cost of maintaining an army, building burhs, and paying thegns and diplomats was immense. Taxes, plunder, and trade were the usual sources of revenue. However, the prospect of a vast, unexplored treasure would be an irresistible draw, a quick reward that could accelerate his conquests and ease the tax burden on his people. Rumors about this treasure could have circulated among the population, perhaps fueled by tales from old Vikings, or by smaller discoveries of buried hoards that occasionally surfaced. The existence of the legend, even if unfounded, could have served strategic purposes. It could have motivated his thegns in the Fyrd with the promise of rewards, or it could have been used as a psychological tool to destabilize the Vikings, suggesting that the Anglo-Saxon king had access to inexhaustible resources. It is unlikely that Edward actually found or relied on a legendary treasure for his campaigns. His strategy for financing the war was much more pragmatic and based on efficient administration of his kingdom. However, the legend of the hidden treasure adds an element of mystery and adventure to Edward's narrative. A king who, in addition to his political and military challenges, might have been secretly driven by the search for a forgotten fortune to forge the destiny of a nation. It is a reminder of how history is often enriched by tales that move between fact and fantasy, lending a more epic tone to a monarch's journey. Edward the Elder's campaign to liberate East Anglia from Viking rule was one of the most decisive chapters in his journey to unify England. This region, comprising the modern-day counties of Norfolk and Suffolk, was one of the hearts of the Danelaw, with a deeply rooted Danish presence and significant power centers. The reconquest of East Anglia was not just a territorial victory, it was a strategic blow that dismantled one of the greatest remaining Viking threats in the south of the island. After Edward's victory at Tettenhall and the fall of Essex, Anglo-Saxon forces gained considerable momentum. The Viking kings and jarls of East Anglia, though still powerful, were isolated and under increasing pressure. Edward's strategy for East Anglia was methodical and relentless, combining the construction of burhs with direct and well-coordinated military campaigns. In 917, Edward's forces and those of his sister, Aethelflaed, intensified their operations. Edward, in particular, moved into the region, building new Burhs at Framlingham and Malden, which served as bases for his operations. These new fortified outposts helped to control access routes and isolate Viking centers. Pressure on the Danes progressively increased. The climax came with a series of decisive confrontations. Anglo-Saxon chronicles report that the East Anglian Vikings, in desperation, attempted a large-scale offensive to break the siege and relieve pressure. They launched attacks against the new Anglo-Saxon Burhs and tried to penetrate Wessex, but were repelled by Edward's forces. In these battles, the tactical superiority and organization of the Anglo-Saxon army proved crucial. The defeat of the Viking forces in the open field and the continuous loss of their territories forced an inevitable surrender. The Viking leaders of East Anglia, seeing that their positions were unsustainable, finally submitted to Edward. The submission was a formal and public event, signifying the end of Danish rule in the region. Many of these leaders were baptized, symbolizing their acceptance of Christian and, by extension, Anglo-Saxon authority. The reconquest of East Anglia had profound consequences. It removed one of the last major concentrations of Viking power in the southeast, opening vast tracts of land for integration into the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The local population, though of mixed ancestry, began to assimilate into Anglo-Saxon law and customs. This monumental victory not only expanded Edward's dominion, but also reinforced the idea that England, under his leadership, was becoming a unified and unquestionable kingdom. It was the final proof that Alfred's vision of an Anglo-Saxon resistance had transformed into the reality of an Anglo-Saxon reconquest. The incorporation of Mercia under Wessex's control was a crucial and largely peaceful process for the unification of England. Unlike the military conquest of the Danelaw, Mercia's integration was a testament to Edward the Elder's political astuteness and the extraordinary influence of his sister, Aethelflæd, the Lady of the Mercians. The kingdom of Mercia, though historically powerful, had become an ally of Wessex during Alfred's reign due to the Viking threat. This alliance evolved into increasing dependency and eventually into a merger under the crown of Wessex. For most of his reign, Edward operated in coordination with his sister and brother-in-law, Æthelflæd, Ealdorman of Mercia. Æthelflæd, though technically a vassal ruler of Alfred, exercised great autonomy. However, after his death in 911, Æthelflæd assumed full power as Lady of the Mercians, Merkna Hlefdijg, a title that demonstrated her authority, but which in practice linked Mercia even more closely to Wessex. Æthelflæd continued the campaign of fortification and reconquest against the Vikings, often in sync with her brother's movements. The true transition to incorporation occurred after Æthelflæd's death in 918. Her only child and heir, Ælfwine, was briefly recognized as Lady of the Mercians. However, Edward's vision was clear. Mercia could no longer be a semi-autonomous kingdom if England was to be truly unified. Mercia's autonomy, even under a leader as capable as Æthelflæd, represented a potential fissure in Anglo-Saxon unity. Thus, in a swift and decisive move, Edward deposed Ælfwine and brought Mercia under direct Wessex control. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that, shortly after Æthelflæd's death, Edward took control of Mercia and removed Ælfwine, taking her to Wessex. This action, though potentially unpopular among some more independent Mercian nobles, was a decisive move towards unification. There was no widespread documented resistance to Ælfwine's deposition, which suggests that Edward's authority was already widely recognized in Mercia, partly due to the loyalty Æthelflæd had cultivated towards her family, and partly due to the need for strong leadership to continue the war against the Vikings. The incorporation of Mercia meant that vast tracts of central England, including the important fortified towns built by Aethelflaed, were now under Edward's direct control. This more than doubled the size of his kingdom and provided an immense territorial and military base for future campaigns against the northern Vikings. Mercia became an integral province of the growing kingdom of Wessex under royal administration. This merger was not a brutal conquest, but a progressive absorption that cemented the path to a single Anglo-Saxon crown over all of England. The incorporation of Mercia was the final piece of the puzzle that Edward was assembling, transforming a strategic alliance into a unified and powerful kingdom. With most of the southern Danelaw and Mercia under his control, Edward the Elder now faced the challenge of dealing with the last Viking strongholds, primarily in the northernmost regions and in enclaves that still resisted Wessex's authority. Expelling these pockets of resistance was a different undertaking from previous campaigns. It was no longer about large Viking kingdoms, but isolated strongholds, stubborn leaders, and populations deeply rooted in their Danish customs. These last strongholds were often more difficult to dislodge. They could be natural fortresses, well defended, or communities that had little to lose and much to gain by maintaining their independence. Resistance could come in the form of guerrilla tactics, small retaliatory raids, or refusal to accept Anglo-Saxon suzerainty. The logistics of maintaining campaigns so far from the heart of Wessex was also a challenge. The main region of persistent resistance was what remained of the Danelaw in Northumbria and the northern Midlands, where cities like York were still under strong Viking control. Although Edward had inflicted a crushing defeat at Tettenhall, the remaining Viking leaders were tenacious. Additionally, there was the complexity of relations with the Welsh and Scottish kingdoms, which, although sometimes submitting to Edward, could also be sources of instability or refuge for the Vikings. The chronicles of the time indicate that Edward continued his policy of building burhs and systematic sieges. He established strongholds at strategic points to isolate these enclaves and cut off their sources of supplies and support. The pressure was constant, and Edward's strategy was one of attrition. He aimed for the long term, forcing the Vikings into submission through a prolonged economic and military siege, rather than just seeking a decisive battle. It is important to note that, although Edward made significant progress against these last strongholds, he did not achieve the complete subjugation of all of Viking Northumbria in his reign. This task would fall in large part to his son, Æthelflæd. However, Edward laid the solid groundwork for this conquest. He drastically reduced the power and influence of the Vikings in England, transforming them from a dominant force into fragmented and weakened groups. The struggle against the last Viking strongholds was a testament to Edward's persistence and the effectiveness of his long-term strategy. Although it was not an instant victory, each subdued pocket of resistance was an additional step towards a united England, free from the Norse threat. The era of the great Viking kingdoms in England was ending, and the vision of a single Anglo-Saxon crown was becoming a tangible reality. As Edward the Elder reconquered territories and expanded Wessex's dominion, the need to unify the kingdom under a coherent body of laws became increasingly pressing. Mere military conquest was not enough to forge a nation. It was necessary to establish a legal and administrative order that would replace the diverse customs of the Vikings and the fragmented Anglo-Saxon systems. Thus, the implementation of Edward's laws was a fundamental pillar of his reign, an effort to create a common basis of justice and governance for all his subjects, regardless of their origin. Edward's laws were largely based on the legal codes established by his father, Alfred, who had drawn inspiration from earlier legal traditions, such as those of Ine of Wessex. However, Edward adapted and expanded them to reflect the reality of a growing kingdom and to address the challenges of integrating populations of Anglo-Saxon and Danish descent under a single authority. The main objective was to ensure internal peace, order, and justice, essential for prosperity and stability. Among the central principles of Edward's laws was the emphasis on collective responsibility and crime prevention. The system of tithing, groups of 10 men responsible for each other's conduct, and 100, a larger administrative division, was strengthened to ensure that crimes were investigated and that culprits were brought to justice. The laws also sought to protect property and regulate trade, vital elements for the kingdom's economic recovery. Edward also addressed issues related to coinage and weights and measures, seeking standardization to facilitate trade and tax collection. He insisted on loyalty to the king as the supreme principle, and punishments for treason and disloyalty were severe. Justice was administered through local and regional assemblies, with royal authority extending through his ealdormen and reeves. A particular challenge was the integration of the former Danelaw territories. In these areas, Danish customs were deeply rooted. Edward's laws did not seek to completely eradicate these practices, but rather to overlay and harmonize them with Anglo-Saxon law. offering a legal framework that was fair to all and that ensured the king's authority. This flexibility, while seeking uniformity, demonstrated a pragmatic understanding of local realities. The codification and enforcement of Edward's laws were a crucial step in the transition from a fragmented kingdom to a unified nation. They provided the necessary legal and administrative structure to sustain military conquests, ensuring that peace was maintained and that Anglo-Saxon society could prosper. Through his laws, Edward not only governed but also shaped the identity of a new kingdom. As Edward the Elder consolidated his power and expanded his dominion, his reputation transcended the borders of Wessex. Gradually, he came to be seen as a figure of power and authority by other British rulers, not only the remaining Anglo-Saxons, but also the Welsh and Scottish kings and princes, and those who still held power in what remained of Viking Northumbria. This respect from neighboring kings was a testament to his military victories, his diplomatic shrewdness, and the effectiveness of his administration, which projected an image of unparalleled strength and stability on the island. Edward's success against the Vikings, especially after the breaking of Danish power in the southern Danelaw and East Anglia, did not go unnoticed. His neighbors watched with growing admiration, and perhaps apprehension, the rapid growth of his kingdom. The Welsh kingdoms, historically independent and frequently in conflict with each other and with the Anglo-Saxons, began to seek agreements with Edward. They saw in Wessex a protector against Viking incursions from the Irish Sea, and in Edward, an authority capable of imposing order. Anglo-Saxon chronicles record that, in 920, a significant meeting took place in Bakewell, where not only the Vikings of York and Northumbria submitted to Edward, but also the Scottish king, Constantine II, and the king of Strathclyde, Owain. This submission, although it might have been more a recognition of suzerainty than a complete annexation, was an event of immense symbolism. It meant that the main rulers of Great Britain recognized in some way Edward's prominence and his position as the most powerful sovereign on the island. This acceptance of Edward's suzerainty was not an unconditional submission, but a pragmatic recognition of the reality of power. These kings might have paid homage or offered oaths of fealty to ensure peace, protect their own kingdoms from Wessex's expansion, or even seek alliance against other enemies. For Edward, these acts of submission were crucial. They not only validated his authority, but also extended his sphere of influence without the need for costly military campaigns. The respect earned by Edward placed him in a unique position. He was the de facto Bretwalda, a lord of kings. The network of marital alliances he built with European royal houses, as explored in Topic 8, also elevated his international status, making him a ruler of considerable prestige. This reputation for power and authority not only solidified his dominion, but also paved the way for the even more complete unification of England by his son and successor, Æthelflæd, who would be the first to call himself King of all Britain. Edward, therefore, not only forged a kingdom, but also established Wessex's hegemony over the island, forever changing the balance of power in Great Britain. While Edward the Elder's military campaigns dominated the chronicles and shaped England's destiny, daily life in Edward's kingdom was a fascinating tapestry of continuity and change, a glimpse into Anglo-Saxon society, economy, and culture under his reign. Far from the battlefields, most of the population lived their lives in villages and small towns, cultivating the land, raising families, and seeking sustenance in a world that, though dangerous, was beginning to find new stability. The economy was predominantly agrarian, based on cereal cultivation and livestock raising. Most of the population consisted of free peasants, ceorls, and serfs, who worked their lord's land. However, Edward's policy of fortification and reconquest had a direct impact on the economy. The Burhs became vibrant centers of trade, protected from incursions and offering markets for agricultural and artisanal products. The security Edward provided allowed long-distance trade to flourish, connecting Wessex to other parts of Great Britain and continental Europe. Edward's minting of high-quality coins also facilitated trade and tax collection, standardizing value and boosting the economy. Anglo-Saxon society was hierarchical, with the king at the top, followed by the ealdormen, nobles who governed large areas, the thanes, warriors, and lesser nobles who served the king directly, and the vast majority of the population. The church, with its bishops, priests, and monasteries, played a central role in religious, social, and educational life. Edward's laws, while aiming for unification, also reflected and reinforced this social structure. The culture of the time was deeply Christian, but still with remnants of pre-conversion pagan influences. Manuscript production, though perhaps not as prolific as under Alfred, continued, with monasteries being centers of learning. Epic poetry, songs, and oral histories would have been popular forms of entertainment and knowledge transmission. The Anglo-Saxon language, the ancestor of modern English, was in full use. Daily life, however, was also marked by precariousness. Life expectancy was short, diseases were common, and the threat of incursions, though diminishing, still loomed over the population. The defenses of the Burhs and constant vigilance were daily reminders that peace was an achievement, not a given. Communities were cohesive and mutual aid was essential for survival. In summary, Edward's reign was not just a period of wars and conquests. It was also a time of reconstruction and rebirth for Anglo-Saxon society. The foundations he laid, security, law and order, and a more stable economic environment, allowed daily life to flourish, building the groundwork for the future prosperity and identity of a united England. Amidst Edward the Elder's calculated victories and strategic decisions, popular imagination, ever eager for elements of mystery and hidden influence, may have given rise to the legend of the shadowy advisor. This is a narrative that falls within the realm of historical fiction and folklore, without any documented corroboration in primary sources. The legend suggests the existence of an enigmatic and mysterious counselor who, operating in the shadows, supposedly whispered audacious strategies and bold plans directly into the king's ears, driving his conquests beyond what would be expected of a monarch of his era. In a court where trust was precious and discretion a virtue, the idea of a counselor whose wisdom was as profound as his presence was veiled is intriguing. He could have been a reclusive hermit, a sage from distant lands, a sorcerer with arcane knowledge, or even a figure with ties to the ancient Anglo-Saxon deities, who manifested only in moments of great need. His influence would be perceived not through open decrees or public appearances, but through the remarkable shrewdness of Edward's tactics, which sometimes seemed to defy expectations. The legend could attribute to this shadowy advisor the inspiration for Edward's most brilliant maneuvers, the strategic and mass construction of burhs in unexpected locations, the perfect military coordination with Aethelflaed, the audacity to advance on the heartlands of the Danelaw, or the sagacity in using diplomacy and tribute when brute force was imprudent. He would be the mind behind the masterstrokes that ensured victories at lower cost or disoriented the Viking enemies. In the context of an epic narrative, the presence of a shadowy advisor adds a layer of fascination and mystery to Edward's character. It suggests that the king was not just a brilliant military and political leader by his own merit, but that he might have had access to a source of wisdom or insight that set him apart. This enigmatic figure could symbolize the king's intuition, the collective wisdom of his most trusted thanes, or even the divine providence itself that was believed to guide just monarchs. While historians focus on the concrete evidence of Edward's achievements, the legend of a counselor as influential as he was invisible serves to highlight the magnitude of his successes. It invites the public to speculate about the hidden forces that can shape history, and to question whether great leaders are merely the result of their own genius, or if they are, at times, guided by invisible hands. It is a way to dramatize the complexity of royal decisions and the aura of mystery that surrounded the great rulers of that era. The relationship between the church and the king was one of the cornerstones of power and stability in Edward the Elder's Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Far from being merely a spiritual institution, the church was a vital political, economic, and social force, and Edward, like his father Alfred, understood the importance of cultivating a strong and mutually beneficial partnership. The church not only legitimized his rule in the eyes of God and men, but also played a crucial practical role in administration and maintaining order. Since Alfred's time, the church had been a bastion of cultural and religious resistance against the pagan influence of the Vikings. Under Edward, this function was reinforced. The king promoted the Christian faith, encouraging the construction of churches, the founding of monasteries, and support for religious communities. He saw the conversion of the Vikings, often a requirement in peace treaties, not only as a religious imperative, but as a tool for integration and cultural assimilation. The baptism of Viking leaders meant not only the salvation of their souls, but their entry into the Christian order and, by extension, into the Anglo-Saxon sphere of influence. The church also provided the kingdom's educational and administrative infrastructure. Monasteries and cathedrals were centers of learning, where scribes copied manuscripts, maintained records, and crucially, wrote the chronicles that recorded the history of Edward's reign. Many of the king's most loyal and educated advisors were ecclesiastics. Bishops and abbots were often powerful figures in the court, holders of lands and influence, and their loyalty was fundamental for regional stability. Edward also intervened in ecclesiastical matters to strengthen his control. He appointed bishops and abbots he trusted, ensuring that the main positions in the church were aligned with his political objectives. The founding of new dioceses or the reorganization of existing ones, such as the division of the Diocese of Winchester in 909, served to optimize ecclesiastical and, indirectly, royal administration. In exchange for his support and protection, the church legitimized Edward's reign, proclaiming him a king anointed by God. This divine sanction was a powerful instrument of social and political cohesion, inspiring loyalty and obedience among the population. The Christian faith was a common bond that united the different peoples under his authority. The symbiotic relationship between the church and Edward was, therefore, essential for the stability and success of his kingdom. It not only provided a moral framework, but also a practical support network that allowed Edward to consolidate his power and proceed with the unification of England. Edward the Elder's reign, while dominated by military campaigns, was also a period of remarkable progress in other spheres, particularly in agricultural and commercial innovations that significantly contributed to the prosperity and stability of his kingdom. Far from the battlefield, the foundations of a prosperous future were being laid in farms and markets, driven by the security and order that the king imposed. In agriculture, the relative stability provided by the reduction of Viking incursions allowed for a resurgence and expansion of production. Abandoned fields were again cultivated, and new lands, perhaps newly reconquered from the Danelaw, were plowed. While there is no evidence of major technological revolutions in Anglo-Saxon agriculture during this period, the consolidation of Burhs and the creation of a network of more secure settlements facilitated the organization of rural labor and the distribution of food. The three-field system, where lands were rotated to maintain soil fertility, though already in use, may have been consolidated in more regions, increasing productivity. Edward's ability to maintain internal peace and protect trade routes meant that agricultural surpluses could be more easily sold in markets, encouraging production. In commerce, innovations were more visible. The Burhs, as previously mentioned, evolved from mere strongholds into vibrant commercial centers. The protection they offered attracted merchants, both local and foreign. Edward implemented regulations for trade, seeking greater standardization of weights and measures, and ensuring the security of transactions. The existence of mints within many boors reinforced royal authority over the economy and provided a reliable currency, essential for large-scale trade. The standardization of Wessex silver coinage helped integrate the economies of newly conquered territories, replacing Viking currencies and facilitating taxation. In addition to internal trade, Edward's reign saw an increase in international trade. England exported goods such as wool, cereals, and possibly slaves, while importing luxury goods and resources not available locally. Edward's marital alliances with European royal houses, as with Otto the Percy, were not only political, they also opened and protected trade routes, facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas. These advancements were not accidental. They were the direct result of effective governance that prioritized security, law, and order. By creating a more predictable and protected environment, Edward allowed the population to dedicate themselves to production and trade with greater confidence. The resulting prosperity not only improved the lives of his subjects, but also provided the necessary fiscal resources to sustain the army and the king's administration, fueling the cycle of conquests and consolidation that would lead to the unification of England. The history of Edward the Elder cannot be fully understood without the context of the dream of unification that preceded him, a grand vision conceived by his father, Alfred the Great. Although Alfred was largely a defensive king, focused on saving what remained of Anglo-Saxon England from Viking annihilation, his ambition went beyond mere survival. He dreamed of an angel sin, a united English nation, not only in opposition to the invaders, but under a single crown governed by common law and faith. Edward not only inherited the throne of Wessex, he inherited and, crucially, continued and expanded this dream of his father. Alfred, in his writings and his policy, had planted the seeds of English identity. He sponsored translations of Latin texts into Old English, reformed education, and forged alliances with other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, such as Mercia, to create a united front against the Vikings. His recapture of London in 886 was a symbolic act of restoring a city he saw as a heart of Anglo-Saxon identity. However, Alfred died before he could achieve full unification. The Danelaw still occupied a substantial part of eastern and northern England. Edward, upon ascending the throne, was not content with maintaining the boundaries of his father's kingdom. He transformed Alfred's defensive posture into an offensive strategy of reconquest. Edward's vision was more expansionist. He saw the limits of Wessex not as the limit of England, but as the base from which the entire island could be reclaimed for the Anglo-Saxons. Each boor built, each city reconquered, each Viking jarl subdued, was a calculated step to realize this dream. The continuity between father and son's vision was remarkable. Both valued law, order, the Christian faith, and military capability. Edward did not act impulsively. He followed a strategic plan that resembled a campaign manual left by Alfred, adapting it to new realities. The collaboration with Aethelflaed, his sister and ruler of Mercia, also reflects the persistence of this unifying vision. Together, they formed a powerful pincer movement that crushed Viking resistance, working towards a common goal. The dream of unification, which in Alfred was more of a hope and an ideological basis, in Edward became a reality in construction. He not only reconquered lands but integrated them administratively and legally, laying the foundations for a truly unified nation. Although the full completion of this dream would fall to his son, Æthelstan, it was Edward who transformed the vision into a tangible undertaking, moving England from a collection of kingdoms to the threshold of a singular national identity. His reign was the essential bridge between the struggle for survival and the rise of a nation. One of Edward the Elder's greatest triumphs, which highlights his growing prominence and authority in Great Britain, was the submission of the northern kings. This event, culminating in 920 at the Assembly of Bakewell, marked a seminal moment when Scottish and Welsh rulers, alongside remaining Viking leaders, recognized Edward's suzerainty. This acceptance was not the result of direct military conquest over these kingdoms, but rather a pragmatic recognition of Wessex's unquestionable power and its king. Edward's power had grown to a point where he was, undoubtedly, the most influential monarch on the island. His victories over the Vikings, the consolidation of Wessex and the incorporation of Mercia, demonstrated a military and administrative strength that no other British kingdom could equal. The northern kingdoms, Scotland under Constantine II, Strathclyde under Owain, and the various Welsh princes, observed Edward's advance with a mixture of respect and apprehension. At Bakewell, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the King of the Scots and all the Scots, and the King of Strathclyde, and all the Strathclyde Welsh, and the kings of Gwent and Dyfed, and all the Welsh submitted to him, Edward, to be his subjects, and he accepted them as his subjects. Although the exact nuances of this submission are debated by historians, it may have been an oath of fealty rather than a formal annexation. The symbolism was immense. For the Welsh kings, Edward's suzerainty could offer protection against Viking incursions from the Irish Sea, as well as stability on their own borders. For Constantine II of Scotland and Owain of Strathclyde, submission could be a way to ensure peace with the powerful Anglo-Saxon king. perhaps even forming an alliance against common enemies or securing support in internal territorial disputes. They recognized that Edward was the de facto Bretwalda, Lord of Britain, and directly challenging him would be foolish. For Edward, this submission was a diplomatic triumph that solidified his position as the supreme leader of Great Britain. It not only increased his prestige but also strengthened the idea of an Anglo-Saxon hegemony over the entire island. Although these kingdoms maintained their internal autonomy, the recognition of Edward's suzerainty paved the way for a more unified policy in Great Britain, a fundamental step towards the eventual concept of Kingdom of England that would be fully realized by his son. The submission of the northern kings was the crowning achievement of a life of conquests and political shrewdness, demonstrating that Edward's power extended far beyond the borders of Wessex. Among Edward the Elder's many campaigns in the Reconquest of the Danelaw, the Siege of Bedford stands out as an emblematic example of his methodical and effective strategy. Bedford, a key town in the Midlands and an important Viking burh, represented a significant obstacle to the Anglo-Saxon advance northward. Its conquest, which occurred in 915, demonstrated Edward's ability to employ sophisticated siege tactics and to use fortification construction as an offensive weapon. Bedford was under the control of a Danish jarl, and its strategic position on the River Great Ouse made it a vital point for controlling riverine and land routes. For Edward, taking Bedford was not just a matter of gaining territory, but of dismantling the Viking power infrastructure and establishing a new Anglo-Saxon center in the region. The Bedford campaign was not a direct and bloody assault battle. Instead, Edward employed an intelligent and patient tactic, the construction of a complementary burh. Anglo-Saxon chronicles report that Edward did not attack the existing town, but built a new burh on the opposite side of the river, strategically positioned to control access and supply flow to the Viking fortification. This maneuver is a testament to Edward's logistical sophistication and planning. By building his own burh, likely an earth and timber structure with walls and a ditch, Edward effectively encircled the Viking town of Bedford, cutting off its communication and supply lines. This strangulation tactic forced the Viking defenders into an unsustainable situation. Over time, without reinforcements or resources, their ability to resist drastically diminished. The result of the siege was the peaceful surrender of the Viking garrison. They were forced to accept Edward's suzerainty and swear loyalty, many of them opting for baptism. With the surrender, the town of Bedford was fully integrated into the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Edward not only retained the new burh he had built, but also repaired and strengthened the town's original fortification, transforming it into a double Anglo-Saxon bulwark against future threats. The Siege of Bedford is an excellent example of Edward's approach. It shows that the king was not only a warrior, but a master of strategy and logistics. His ability to build and use burhs offensively, to isolate and subdue the enemy without the need for a massive bloodbath, was a hallmark of his military genius. This victory not only expanded his dominion into the heart of the Midlands, but also sent a clear message to the other Viking strongholds. Resistance would be futile against Edward's inexorable and methodical expansion. In the Anglo-Saxon universe, where faith and destiny intertwined with daily life and great royal undertakings, the idea of a legend of the ancient prophecy would have a profound resonance. Although this is a narrative that lies in the realm of speculation and folklore, without historical corroboration in primary sources, it adds a layer of mysticism and divine purpose to Edward the Elder's journey. The legend suggests the existence of an ancient prophecy that foretold the unification of all England under a descendant of Alfred the Great, bestowing an almost messianic character on the mission of Edward and his successors. This prophecy, perhaps transmitted orally for generations or recorded on a forgotten parchment, might have spoken of a time of chaos and fragmentation, followed by the emergence of a leader of royal lineage who would bring peace and unity to the land. It might have mentioned signs in the sky, notable events, or specific characteristics of the predestined king. The fact that Edward was the son of the revered Alfred the Great and the legitimate heir to his vision would naturally place him as a strong candidate to fulfill such a prediction. For the Anglo-Saxon people, exhausted by decades of war and Viking devastations, belief in a divine prophecy that promised the restoration of order and the creation of a united nation would be a powerful source of hope and motivation. It would legitimize Edward's campaigns, transforming him from a mere conqueror into an instrument of destiny. With each victory, each reconquered territory, each subdued Viking jarl, the prophecy would solidify in the popular imagination, confirming that the king was following a predetermined path. The monks and clerics, who were the main holders of knowledge and the chroniclers of the time, could have played a crucial role in the dissemination, or even creation, of such legends. By associating the royal lineage of Wessex with a divine prophecy, they reinforced the authority of the church and the king, promoting social cohesion and loyalty to the throne. The idea that God had chosen an heir of Alfred to forge a Christian and united England would be a powerful propaganda tool in a period of intense religiosity. Although we do not find the legend of the ancient prophecy in historical documents, its plausibility lies in the cultural and religious context of the time. It serves to illustrate how national identity and royal purpose were often constructed not only by facts, but by narratives that infused meaning and grandeur into the actions of leaders. For Edward, this imagined prophecy could have been a psychological impulse, the conviction that his struggle was not just for land and power, but for a greater destiny, traced by the stars and blessed by the heavens. For England, despite all the strength and vision of Edward the Elder, England's unification policy underwent a significant turning point with the death of his remarkable sister, Æthelflæd, the Lady of the Mercians, in 918. Her passing was not just a personal loss for Edward, but an event with profound consequences for the unification policy, opening a new chapter in the relationship between Wessex and Mercia. Æthelflæd's legacy, however, would remain, shaping the path the king would follow. Æthelflæd had governed Mercia with impressive autonomy and effectiveness since the death of her husband, Aethelred, in 911. She was not a queen consort, but a military and political leader in her own right, whose fortification and reconquest campaigns in the Midlands were crucial for containing and expelling the Vikings. Her strategic collaboration with Edward, with both siblings coordinating military movements and pressuring the Danes from different directions, was an unstoppable force. Her death, therefore, left a vacuum of power and leadership in the heart of England. After Æthelflæd's demise, her only child, Ælfwine, was briefly recognized as the new Lady of the Mercians. However, Edward's vision was clear. Mercia could no longer be a semi-autonomous kingdom if England was to be truly unified. Mercia's autonomy, even under a leader as capable as Æthelflæd, represented a potential fissure in Anglo-Saxon unity. Thus, in a swift and decisive move, Edward deposed Ælfwine and brought Mercia under direct Wessex control. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the Mercians submitted to him, Edward, and chose him as their lord. This action, though without great documented resistance, marked the end of Mercian autonomy and its complete integration into Edward's kingdom. It was a demonstration of his determination not to let family ties overshadow his greater goal of creating a single, powerful England. The consequences of this action were immediate and lasting. The direct incorporation of Mercia more than doubled the territory under Edward's control and gave him access to the strategic Burhs built by Æthelflæd. This consolidated Anglo-Saxon power over a vast expanse of England, providing an impregnable base for future campaigns against the northern Vikings and a springboard for full unification. Æthelflæd's legacy, though her direct lineage did not continue to govern Mercia, was that of a war heroine and one of England's architects. Her vision and courage facilitated Mercia's transition to Wessex rule, making unification smoother than it might have been. Æthelflæd's death was a catalyst for the finalization of Edward's unifying project, transforming a strategic alliance into a single and powerful kingdom. Edward the Elder's vision of a united England was grand, but he understood that its realization would not occur in a single reign. The importance of his heirs for the continuation of his work was, therefore, a central concern, and his many sons and daughters would be the foundation of England's future. Edward, through his strategic marriages and the education of his offspring, ensured that the seed of his dynasty would spread, both to govern at home and to forge international alliances. Edward had at least 14 children, including several sons who would go on to govern or influence the kingdom. The most prominent among them was Æthelstan, his eldest son from his first marriage, to Ecgwin. Although his mother's legitimacy has been questioned in some later sources, Æthelstan was raised in the court of Aethelflaed, his aunt, in Mercia, which gave him valuable experience and deeply connected him to the martial and administrative traditions of that region. He would be the most direct successor to Edward's unification project. Besides Æthelstan, Edward had other sons who would become kings, Edmundar and Eadred, both sons from his third marriage to Eadgifu of Kent. The existence of multiple adult male heirs ensured the continuity of the royal line and reduced the risk of devastating succession disputes, although rivalries between brothers could arise. The preparation of these princes for governance was a priority, training them in the arts of war, administration, and diplomacy. However, Edward's daughters were equally, if not more, important for the security and prestige of the dynasty. As explored previously, Topic 8, he married them to some of the most powerful rulers of continental Europe: Otto I of the Holy Roman Empire, Hugh the Great of France, and Louis of Aquitaine, among others. These unions transformed the Wessex court into a center of international power and influence. They ensured that England had powerful allies and that the legitimacy of the new Anglo-Saxon dynasty was recognized throughout Europe. The daughter of Edward became a title of prestige in itself. This numerous and well-placed progeny was the guarantee that Edward's unification work would not die with him. The vision of a single England, forged in the struggle against the Vikings, would be continued by the children he had trained and the alliances he had established. The importance of his heirs lay not only in their ability to wield the sword, but also in their aptitude for governance, legislation, and forging diplomatic ties. They were the bridge to the future, ensuring that their father's legacy would transform into a lasting nation. After a reign of more than 25 years, marked by incessant military campaigns and a relentless pursuit of unification, Edward the Elder died on July 17, 924, in Farndon-on-Dee, Cheshire. His death was not an abrupt event in the midst of a battle, but a natural conclusion to a life dedicated to the consolidation and expansion of Wessex. The king's demise marked the beginning of a new chapter in England's history, with the passing of the baton to his successors, especially his son, Æthelstan. In the last years of his reign, Edward had achieved remarkable feats. He had reconquered much of the Danelaw, incorporated Mercia, and received the submission of the northern kings, including Scots and Welsh. His kingdom was, in essence, the largest and most powerful political entity in Anglo-Saxon Great Britain ever seen. He had transformed his father's struggle for survival into a successful unification campaign, preparing the ground for what would become the Kingdom of England. The transition of power after Edward's death, though crucial, was not without challenges. Succession in Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was not always linear, and the existence of several adult sons from different marriages could generate disputes. The immediate succession went to his eldest son, Æthelstan. However, there was some initial resistance, particularly in Mercia, which seemed to prefer one of his brothers. This hesitation highlights that, although Edward had unified the territory, political cohesion and national identity were still evolving. Nevertheless, Æthelstan proved to be a worthy successor to his father. He not only maintained Edward's gains but expanded them even further, culminating in the famous Battle of Brunanburh, 937, where he defeated a coalition of Scots, Welsh, and Vikings, solidifying his right to proclaim himself the first king of all Britain. The passing of the baton from Edward to Æthelstan was not a simple exchange of crowns. It was the transfer of a vision and an ongoing project. Edward's death symbolized the end of an era of consolidation and the beginning of an era of crowning. He had paved the way, making the unthinkable possible, a united England. His passing was a crucial transition point, where the foundations he and his father built would be tested and finally transformed into a cohesive and powerful kingdom, a lasting testament to his life of service and ambition. The new chapter that opened would be the full materialization of his legacy. Edward the Elder's reign was not just a series of military conquests. It was, in fact, the crucial path to the formation of a united kingdom. consolidating the foundations for the eventual emergence of England as a cohesive political entity. His impact on British history is immeasurable, for it was he who transformed his father Alfred's vision into a tangible reality, irreversibly shaping the island's destiny. Edward's primary legacy was the reconquest and integration of most of the Danelaw. He not only expelled the Vikings from vast regions of the East and Midlands, but also incorporated these territories into Wessex's administrative and legal system. This policy of assimilation, rather than mere conquest, ensured that newly acquired lands and populations became an integral part of a larger kingdom, and not just subjugated provinces. The reintroduction of Anglo-Saxon law and the promotion of Christian culture in these areas contributed to a more homogeneous identity. The incorporation of Mercia was another fundamental pillar. By bringing the powerful kingdom of Mercia under direct Wessex control after Æthelflaed's death, Edward eliminated the last major internal Anglo-Saxon political division. This created a continuous territorial mass, an unparalleled power base that stretched from the south to the center of England. This territorial unification was vital for projecting authority over the remaining Viking kingdoms and for deterring future incursions. His Burhs strategy, inherited and expanded from Alfred, was essential for this consolidation. The fortified towns were not just defensive points, but centers of administration, trade, and coinage, acting as catalysts for urbanization and economic recovery. They ensured that each territorial gain was maintained and developed, creating a network of control that strengthened central power. Edward also forged a network of suzerainty and alliances with the Welsh and Scottish kingdoms, as well as with European royal houses. Although he did not directly conquer them, the recognition of his authority by the northern kings established Wessex as the hegemonic power in Great Britain, preparing the ground for the idea of a king of all Britain. In short, Edward not only inherited a kingdom and a war, he transformed them. His systematic and visionary actions, military reorganization, legal and administrative integration, economic revitalization through the Burhs, and diplomatic alliances paved the way for the formation of an English national identity. He left his successors not just a legacy of victories, but the structure and mindset of a kingdom that was about to become a unified nation. The path to a united kingdom was, undeniably, paved by the elder king. With the death of Edward the Elder, the post-Edward scenario was one of a fundamentally transformed England, a testament to a reign forged in battle and diplomacy. It was not yet a fully unified kingdom in its final form, but it was incomparably closer to that goal than at the beginning of his reign. Edward's journey had left an indelible mark on the island's political and economic landscape, preparing the ground for the reigns of his successors and the flourishing of an English national identity. From a political standpoint, post-Edward England was dominated by an expanded and strengthened Wessex. The Danelaw, although still with Viking enclaves in the north, especially York, was significantly reduced. Mercia had been integrated, eliminating the main internal division among the Anglo-Saxons. Wessex's authority extended over a vast and contiguous area. The Welsh and Scottish kings had recognized the suzerainty of the King of Wessex, establishing a hierarchy of power in Great Britain that did not exist before. This prominence of Wessex had created the conditions for a single monarch to rule all of England. The administrative structure of the Burhs and the enforcement of Edward's laws ensured more centralized and efficient governance. From an economic standpoint, the relative security and stability provided by Edward's reign allowed for remarkable rebirth and growth. The Burhs flourished as centers of trade and production, driving urbanization and the revitalization of trade routes. The minting of standardized coins and the regulation of commerce facilitated exchanges, resulting in greater prosperity. The reclamation of agricultural lands and the expansion of production fed the population and generated resources for the royal treasury. England, which had previously suffered from raids and disruptions, now benefited from a more predictable environment for economic development. The cultural legacy was also evident. The Christian faith was consolidated and had largely replaced pagan practices in the formerly Viking territories. The Anglo-Saxon language and the customs of Wessex became increasingly dominant. The idea of an angel sin, of an English people with a common identity was stronger than ever. Edward left a kingdom with a robust army, a functional administration, and a clear sense of direction. He had proven that it was possible not only to contain the Vikings, but to reverse their gains and assimilate them. The post-Edward scenario was one of a rising nation, ready for the final step of total unification, which would be achieved by his son, Æthelstan. The England that Edward left behind was a land with a purpose, forged with the sword and diplomatic shrewdness of a king who saw beyond the challenges of his time, envisioning a unified future.